Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, what is going on? Welcome back to the channel. We are here at 1-0 for a very special video because it's not your typical A-Leagues with 1-0 show. I'm going to talk about the MLS and the A-Leagues. So if you're in Australia, obviously know our league is the A-Leagues, and if you're unaware, the MLS is the American top division. Now, it was often a league that could compare to the A-Leagues, and the A-Leagues was often sometimes getting compared to the MLS because similar sort of countries in the sense of football maybe isn't your biggest sport, but there's still so much room for it to grow, but there is still that huge passion behind it. I'm going to talk to you guys today about how the A-League can learn from the MLS because I personally feel like the MLS is taking it to new levels with the A-League stepping a couple directions backwards when we should be in that similar sort of pathway to America and how they're dealing with the MLS. Now, I'm not saying that it's the exact same scenario. I understand that America's got a much bigger population. They've got much more, a lot of more money is being put into the MLS as opposed to the A-League. I know they can maybe attract players like an Ibrahimovic and David Beckham better because they've got the LA lights. They've got the New York City concrete jungle where dreams are made of. These lights will inspire you because you're here in the New York, as Alicia Keys said. But I'm going to try and explain some ways that the MLS try to make their game a little bit different and try to take it away from the traditional sort of route and build their own identity, because I think identity is the biggest thing as to why the MLS has grown, which I think is also the other reason why the A-Leagues sort of slowed down a little bit. And to start off with, I'm going to talk about the MLS Super Draft. Now, the MLS Super Draft, if you're unaware of what a draft scenario is or what a draft is, in any sort of sport, we've got it in the NBA. If you're here in Australia, we've got it in the AFL. It's in the NFL, all those sort of sports. It's whoever finishes last on the ladder that season. To put into context, following the Premier League, if Newcastle United finish last on the ladder, they will get the number one draft pick. Now, the Premier League, I don't think the draft would obviously work. I think in the top clubs, it's not going to work, which is why I'm talking about the A-Leagues and the MLS. In the MLS, it's worked pretty well because if Seattle Sounders, for example, they finish last on the ladder, they get the number one draft pick. Unless there is an expansion team coming in, so in the A-Leagues, for example, unless it's a MacArthur FC coming in, then MacArthur FC obviously get the first draft pick because they're a new team. But if you look at last season, Melbourne Victory finished bottom of the ladder. Melbourne Victory heading into the next season get the number one draft pick. Now, this number one draft pick isn't what it's like in the AFL or the NBA where you draft this player, they are now a part of your team. Okay, and I know it's different where there's a lot more soccer, like we don't have that second division sort of route to find these players. But here in Australia, what that number one draft position can do, it gives you a free trial and a loan sort of thing to come and have a pre-season with your respective club that drafts you. In the MLS, that's exactly what they do. They go and sign a player on a draft. Number one draft, you get the best pick of the best player around the country. How I would do it here in Australia is you cannot draft somebody from Cambodia, random example, but you can't draft somebody from England. Or if you do, there has to be under the age of 20 years old. Okay, but I personally think for Australia to benefit in the long term, I'd personally have it. The requirements are to draft 2 or 3 players with an Australian background, with Australian heritage, and then you can go and sign a young English kid on a trial period, all that sort of stuff. Okay, so for an example, Jack Harrison, he's now killing it at Leeds. He was the number one draft pick by New York City. He was drafted in the MLS and then got traded to New York City. Clint Dempsey was another one who got drafted in the MLS and then made the move. Now, what this means, so you're not actually giving these players a set contract, welcome to the team. You're giving them an incentive to, okay, cool, now I can train and I have these eyes on me at a club like Melbourne Victory, at a club like Sydney FC. Now I need to fight for my roster spot. This, I personally think, it's a cool idea. It's an idea that could work. It's an idea that just makes it a little bit more exciting. It's something that if you finish last on the ladder can narrow that difference from the bottom and the top team in the ladder. Now, I know everyone here wants a second division here in Australia. I don't know how that's going to go. Obviously, see with that, MLS doesn't have a second division. But to reinstate my point, Melbourne Victory last season finished last on the ladder. Because obviously last season we struggled, we weren't doing that well. And obviously a lot of clubs don't have big financial support to go and sign players. Victory is one of the exceptions. Most teams the following year, there's a fair chance they're not going to be that good. There's a fair chance they're going to have young kids in their team. They've got a lot to learn. Victory in last year's example would come into the new season with a number 1 draft pick. This draft pick can be used on a player who's in the MPL or is at another club, but is really getting no game time at all. They can draft this player. It means that the club doesn't actually have to pay, any sort of fee or anything like that. Draft this player, you now fight for a spot. Okay, so it's a cool idea. I'm not saying that we should do it next week. No, it's got its pros and its cons. Its cons are that, is it really necessary? Do we really need it? Is it necessary maybe to help grow young Australians and give them sort of another incentive to that? If they don't get picked up in the A-League, there's always the draft. There's always that possibility. Now, how do these clubs find these players to draft? Well, that's when we've got to just need to improve a lot more from the grassroots level. We need more people coming and watching games, putting themselves out there, showing they do show a little bit, they have a bit of a care factor for the people in lower leagues and in the MPL and club and community leagues and places like that, so that they can be on the radar of these clubs. But initially, it might probably be used just for team players around the A-League who are young, on the fringe, but can't really get game time. So I think that's something that could maybe work in the A-League, but I think it's just a cool sort of scenario that brings a little bit of spice to the competition. Something different. We can do it for 5 years, if that. I'm not saying it's got to totally flip the A-Leagues, but it's just a suggestion that I think the MLS used, and they've used it pretty well. Next up, the MLS, and again, we could do a whole documentary on what the A-League needs to do to improve and stuff like that. But the MLS, what they did so well was nail down the team locations and the club locations. And what I mean by that is, obviously they've got such a diverse ethnicities around all of America. They've got so many different cultural backgrounds. We know they've got a massive Mexican population, Cuban population, Spanish population, massive. They've got heaps. They've got the African American population as well in the United States too. Inter Miami, the new team that's come around, David Beckham's owner, they've got a massive, again, South American presence in Miami. We know whether it's Argentinians, whether it's Cubans, whether it's Puerto Ricans, so much of a South American influence in Miami. It's another reason why, cool, let's cherish that. That's an awesome place where we know they love football. Let's build it to sort of them. The colorways help. The color patterns of a pink and a floristy sort of, not floristy, like a palm tree sort of thing. Obviously, it helps Miami, but it's quite South American, quite tropical. You've got LAFC. Then another LAFC came in, and here's another big part. LAFC came in, a massive cultural presence, Mexican cultural presence. So guess which players they tried to sign in attempt to lure in these new fans? Carlos Vera, Jonathan Dos Santos, Giovanni Dos Santos, big Mexican players. Let's use it in the A-League, for example. Melbourne Victory on my team. Got to use it for example. Melbourne Victory. We've obviously got here in Melbourne the biggest Greek population outside of Athens, outside of Greece. Melbourne is huge. So many Greeks. We've got so many Italians. We've got so much of a cultural, ethnic background here in Melbourne. Let's try and maybe look for some Greek players, some Italian players. We've got Margiotta now, and let me know, the Italian guys who I know who go to the games, they love him. He's an Italian playing for their favourite team, Melbourne Victory. It's just little ways like that where we can sort of just improve and build that connection with fans. Stuff like that I think could go a long way for the A-Leagues to follow, something that MLS did really well. Inter Miami, Orlando City, when they first came around, they signed Kaká. Orlando is another place where they've got a very strong South American presence. Kaká, one of the best Brazilians to ever touch a football. Now, I'm not saying that the A-League Sydney FC has to go and sign the biggest Argentinian player in the world, stuff like that. I'm just trying to say, like, even if it's young kids, some players that the fans can relate to, whether it's Australians, whether it's all this sort of stuff. You've got to nail the culture. We had Western United, and they put them obviously in the western suburbs, down Geelong sort of way. There's no real cultural factor in there behind where football fans can get behind a new team. Okay, and by cultural factor, I'm not saying you need to just have every single team be Croatian, Serbian, Greek, Italian, Mexican, African, Jamaican, all that sort of stuff. I'm just saying you need, like, Western Sydney Wanderers is the perfect example. Perfect example of you establish a new expansion team in a place where they're football crazy, but they are all the same sort of family. They're all the same sort of people. The cultural footballing society sort of behaviors, or all this, they're all quite similar. We know that they've got a very strong Arabic presence in Western Sydney, which is why their crowds, their atmosphere was unbelievable at the games. You look at Sydney FC, they've got a quite different crowd, Sydney FC and Western Sydney Wanderers. You're hitting two different sort of cultural regions. Then now we're looking at it, if you want to play a second division here in Australia, which is obviously something that's been on a topic for quite a long time now. I'm not too sure when it's going to come in. I'm not too sure how successful it's going to be, but it's something I'm willing to see them try. South Melbourne, we know if you're here in Melbourne, South Melbourne, massive Greek influence. Now, we know that the large majority of the fans, if South Melbourne were to play in the A-League men's competition, would be Greek. Yes, it's good, but in another way, I think the FA here in Australia don't want that. I think we are so driven by mainstream media and trying to eliminate this football hooligan sort of nature and this toxic sort of, they're so hooliganish, they're so dirty, they're so messy, all this sort of stuff. I think that's one of the big reasons why they don't want the second division. Because if they do use clubs like Melbourne Knights, who are obviously a major Croatian presence, it's going to maybe make the demographic going to these games a little bit older, which personally I don't have an issue with. I think families can still go to the games. I think as long as they're obviously not being dangerous and harmful and racist and homophobic and all that sort of stuff, then I don't see an issue with fans being passionate behind the teams that they follow. And if you have a easier connection to make with the team, whether it be your favorite player is the same background as you, or the club represents the same sort of nationality that you have as well, I think that's a huge benefit that we can use to our advantage. Now, the MLS have done that really well. Another thing the MLS have done is obviously financial backing. I'm not going to get into the nits and bolts. Not nits and bolts, is that the same? Nits and bolts? I don't know. Of all the financial stuff, because obviously that's stuff that we don't really know that much. The government and stuff can do whatever they want. Who knows? But luring these players in, but also playing their homegrown talent. Okay, Alphonso Davies, homegrown talent from the MLS. Look where he's at now. McKennie, homegrown talent. Look where he's at now. Okay, there's quite a few American players. Stoke City have just signed a player who got drafted in the MLS. I think his name's Zeke, something like that. Played in the MLS, got drafted, came on, tore it up in his first season, made a move, got another move. Now he's just signed to Stoke City. Clint Dempsey was the same. Jack Harrison, we're seeing what he's doing at Leeds. He's an absolute baller. Last season he was superb as well. He was on Man City's books. I think that's some of the stuff that the A-Leagues could follow, and some of the stuff that the A-Leagues should try and make. Unfortunately here we're trying to be so much like Europe and trying to be too traditional. I think recently, maybe like with a change in A-League men and A-League women, I think that's a step in the right direction of us trying to just be a little bit modern and just try and, we don't have to be like the English Premier League, okay? We can try to be our own sort of unique league and our unique competition. Now, there's many more stuff. I thought it was a cool idea. Michael, big ups Michael, he replied to this on the Instagram and he said, will the MLS and the A-League ever be on the same sort of wavelength? So to final that question off, I think we have all possibilities too, but I think the MLS just obviously such a much more greater population, and just financially, I think they're a lot better situation than us as well in the sense of developing football. And I think at grassroots level, Americans have got a little bit better and a little bit more correct than maybe what we have here in Australia as well, where I think the MLS are going to continue to reach new heights, where the A-Leagues can slowly start to catch up. But I think in the long term, I think the MLS will definitely only get better and get pretty exciting as well, and make it with the World Cup as well. Sorry, in the future being in America too, it's only going to grow the game. It's only going to help the MLS. It's only going to help American players. It's only going to be a positive thing. So let me know if you enjoyed this sort of video. If you disagree with a lot of the things that I said, leave it in the comments down below. I'm not saying that everything that I'm saying is what's going to work, but I'm also aware that the MLS isn't really a league that's huge at the same time. So there's a lot of stuff where your Premier League fans or Bundesliga fans or Serie A fans are a little bit unaware about when it comes to the MLS and what they're doing over there. Whereas I'm just wanted to suggest a couple of things. Michael sent in a question. I want to suggest a couple of things on what maybe the A-Leagues could do to try and replicate the success of the MLS and sort of the growth that the MLS has been having in the last couple of seasons. So, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, thank you very much for watching. I'm Costa. This is 1-0. If you enjoyed this video, if you enjoy the future videos or the recent videos, please make sure to like and subscribe. It all helps the channel out. Follow the Instagram at _1-0. I'm going to see you guys next week for another video. In the meantime, deuces.